Hello everyone, and welcome to this intro to our Lesson 4 asynchronous activity for this week. What I'm going to do in this short video, hopefully again that's short, I'm going to do a brief reflection on some of the things that we discussed in Lesson 3 in Tuesday's class. Also provide you with a focused reading for this week's activity online. So instead of looking at a video and using that as a focus for our discussion, I'm actually going to ask you to do a reading that looks at the classification of learning objects, and that will kind of help you to articulate the different types of learning objects and the different characteristics, and hopefully serve as a resource for you as you move forward in the course. We are also going to have a asynchronous discussion that I'm hoping to facilitate in the discussion thread on this page. And what I'm asking you to do in that discussion is to pick one learning theory that you really that really resonates with you and you think that you use in your regular teaching practice. And then I'm going to ask you to extend that a little bit and think about what would be one web-based learning tool that would align with the learning theory that you feel is most appropriate to your professional practice. And I've chosen John Dewey's quote, "If we teach today's students as we taught yesterday's, we rob them as tomorrow," because I think it's a quote that really ties in the important relationship between learning theory and pedagogy and technological advancement. So we always have to keep this in mind. How do we advance in both our pedagogy as well as our technology use? So I want to start off with a reflection on Lesson 3, and I want to thank you for your work and contributions. One of the observations I've made is that as a group, you've done a really good job of taking on any task that I've given to you and kind of diving right in. So I really appreciate your trust that I'm providing you with some activities that hopefully will stimulate some interesting discussion, as well as the curation of resources that can be valuable in your teaching practice. So thank you for your commitment to those activities, and I hope that that continues as we move on. I'm also open to feedback on any types of activities people have experienced in other courses and they might want to take on. One of the things that we did end up talking about last night was the characteristics of learning objects. And so some of the characteristics that were identified from the discussion was that they are accessible, and I liked to frame this as being web-based. So I was speaking with some students after class about things like apps, and using an application, whether it be an iPad app or an Android app, regardless of the platform, we have to understand that accessibility is really device and platform agnostic. And so when we're looking at developing learning objects, we want to make them as accessible as possible. And so hosting them on a website or embedding them on a website is going to be more accessible than creating an iOS app, for example. So as long as you have a browser and internet connection, you should be able to use a learning object. The other element that was identified is that they're self-directed, and so this is going to be true for the majority of learning objects. Now, you will find that there are some learning objects that are social in nature, and so while they are self-directed, they are also codependent on other individuals. And we'll get into that a little bit more as you read the article from this week. Learning objects are also required to be participatory, and I'm using the word participatory rather than using the word interactive. And what this essentially means is that at some point during the learning object, the learner or the user has to interact or engage in the learning object and contribute to the learning object in some way. And then what this then leads to, as you mentioned in the discussion, is an assessment of the learning. And that's a key aspect of a learning object. There has to be some component of the learning object where is there an assessment of the learning. Now, there were some characteristics that we didn't get a chance to discuss last night, so I want to just briefly list them. And again, you'll find that these are explored in more depth in the article from this week, but I'm hoping that this will act as kind of a cognitive trigger for some key terms. So the first one is that it's usually going to be done in smaller units. So what this means is, whereas previously we might look at a lecture, quote unquote, as an hour or 90 minutes or however long your class might be, a learning object is going to take that entire time frame and break it down into smaller units. And so this might be 5 to 15 unit chunks where the individual is interacting with the object in a very small condensed time frame. So that's one other characteristic of learning objects. Another one is that they're self-contained, and what this means is that they have a beginning, middle, and an end, and that beginning, middle, and end is self-contained so that the learner does not have to go outside of the web-based application in order to engage with the content. So what an example would be, if you look at our weekly postings for these synchronous and asynchronous sessions, all of the videos and the readings and the questions, they're all embedded in the one page itself, and so they're self-contained in that regard. You're not being asked to click a link to go out to YouTube and then come back to the page, and that hyperlinking is not necessarily what we're doing in this regard for learning objects. We're looking at embedding content so that it's all self-contained. The other thing that we haven't really talked about, and most of the characteristics that were identified in the discussion were actually from the user's perspective, so it being accessible and self-directed and participatory, that's all from the user's perspective. But from the designer's perspective, we also have to think about the idea that a learning object should be able to be repurposed, or it should be able to mutate. And what that means is an individual should be able to take the learning object that was designed by one, faculty or professor or teacher and repurpose it and repackage it and change it a bit so that it's appropriate for deployment in another context. And the reason for this is the development of learning object takes a considerable amount of time and financial resources, and so they need to be able to be used in a variety of contexts. And this is something that is talked about at length in the reading, and hopefully you'll draw attention to that as you're going through it. The last one, which kind of talks to, I think actually this is the second last one, which kind of talks to the idea of something being repurposed or mutated, is it should be portable. And what that means is you should be able to take a learning object and either deploy it on a website, or embed it in a learning management system, or embed it in some other platform that you might be using for the distribution of content. So the portability of learning object is really important, and this is why we use web-based learning tools rather than going with a platform-specific web-based application. Okay, here's the last one. So the last one is that it should be able to be aggregated, and what that means is that you're going to be able to use metadata or tags. And if you're not sure, or if you don't have any experience with that term, that would be a term I definitely recommend that you Google. But the idea is you should be able to apply metadata or tagging information that adds a layer on top of the learning object, so that a search engine would be able to look at those tags and be able to bring up that learning object if somebody was searching for that information. So one example is, if I was to take our Nearpods as a learning object, I should be able to add metadata to the Nearpods that would be something in the effect of educational technology, learning objects, my name Shawn Lennie, UOIT. All of these things could be metadata that's added on top of learning objects, so that if anybody was to search any one of those terms, the learning object would pop up for them. Those are some of the characteristics. I screwed up. There's one more. They have to be searchable. So searchable is connected to aggregated, and what that means is that they can be indexed and found from a search engine. I think that's the last one. Let's press the button and find out. Okay, there we go. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about, which I brought up, a few people brought up at the end after kind of post-class, was what's the difference between a learning tool and a learning object? So a few of you kind of mentioned that this wasn't really clear, so I thought I would kind of identify it in this video so that it's clear for everybody. So a learning tool and a learning object, they are terms that are often used interchangeably, but they don't mean the same thing. So basically, a learning tool is the platform that is used to create learning objects, and a learning object is the artifact or the lesson that the learner interacts with. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples here. So when we look at TED Ed, so TED Ed, and I'll jump to the TED Ed and back to this presentation. So TED Ed is a website that can be used for the purpose of building a learning object. So this is an example of a learning object. So what you're seeing right now is the learning object itself. But if I go back to the TED Ed homepage, this is the platform that can be used to build the object. And what you can see right here at the top is it says create a lesson. Now, I'm not going to go through how to create a TED Ed for you, but if you're interested in as a platform, as a tool, then you might want to take a look at it, because it is a very popular tool that's being used by educators around the world. But essentially what a TED Ed allows you to do is to create a learning object that is self-contained, searchable, can be aggregated, includes assessment. All of those characteristics can be found in a TED-Ed. So if we go and we take a look at this TED-Ed, which was created by Robin Kay, this is a TED-Ed on photography. And so what we can do is we can watch this video, which Robin created, and then we can look at the thinking. So there's some questions that are connected to the video. Okay, so we can scroll through these questions and answer these questions. Then we can click on this link that says dig deeper. And so there's a Google Drive presentation, and you're being asked to create and all this kind of stuff. And then there's a discussion thread. And so and there's an end finally. So what this is a self-contained learning object where, again, the TED-Ed platform is being used to create this learning object. So there is a difference between the platform, which is the learning tool, and the object, which is the artifact or product that is created. I'll give you another example. So our Nearpods are an example. So this is Nearpod. So if you were to go into Nearpod and create an account, so I'll log in just quickly into my own account so you can take a look. What you're going to get is Nearpod is the tool that can be used to create a learning object, and any one of the lessons, quote unquote, that we've used. So these are some of my lessons. So this, for example, is lesson 3. I can open this, and now this is the learning object itself. So again, Nearpod is the tool, but lesson 3 is the learning object. Okay, and then that based on what we've done, we can do a live session, so we can scroll through this, and I can ask you a question and get some feedback and that sort of thing. Okay, and you build this using Nearpod as a tool. Okay, the last one I wanted to show you was BlendSpace, and BlendSpace, Nearpod, TED-Ed. They're all very similar, tools that can be used to create learning objects, and there are hundreds others, but I'm just showcasing these 3 for the purpose of this video. So this is the BlendSpace homepage. So when you get here, what you see is create a lesson in 5 minutes, and you can see all their different, I'll just call them selling features, because what they're trying to do is sell a platform, but it is a very good platform. But if we click on the gallery, then we can start to see learning objects that have been created by other educators for the purpose of supporting student learning. And these are actually organized by topical areas. So you have math, social studies, language arts, technology, art, and so on and so forth. So you can go through all of these, and you can click any one of these. So for example, digital storytelling, something I'm interested in. And what this is now it's a BlendSpace on digital storytelling. So I can click on this, and it opens up this web page on digital storytelling, or at least it's supposed to. None of these work. I'm sure this was not the best example, but they should work. Let me just do this instead. There we go. I was clicked on the link itself rather than the article. And then what I can do is I can scroll through here, and I can see all these different articles, and I could chat, I could comment, I can do these different things. But again, what's important about this is not the tool itself, the object itself. It's just I'm trying to illustrate the difference between BlendSpace, the tool, which is the platform that is used to create the object, and the learning object itself. And this object would be called digital storytelling. So I'm hoping that provides some clarity around the difference between a learning tool and a learning object. And if you have any questions, please feel free to bring them up either in our next class, or you can post them up in the discussion. So up next, what I'm going to ask you to do is continue on going through this page, this lesson, and it has 3 primary components. The first one is there is a reading, as I mentioned earlier, called Classifying Learning Objects. I've embedded it in this page, but you can also download it from Scribe, which is the platform that I'm using to host the page. And that reading is going to be the foundation of the discussion that we have. And for the discussion, I'm asking you to identify one learning theory that resonates with you, and then to identify a web-based learning tool that you feel would support the development of a learning object that would engage students using that learning theory. Now, as with the previous lesson, there is a section called Go Deeper, and what this provides is some links and a video. If you're interested, they're not required, but just some resources that might help you to go a little bit deeper into exploring the relationship between learning theories and web-based learning tools. So that's it. I hope that you enjoy this asynchronous lesson, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me either through email, through the Twitter feed, or in the discussion thread.